let us start with welcome to our nonprofit conversation or panelists about walking burnout and what that means. I think it's fun, and I think that there was some kind of play in The Walking Dead and walking burnout, but I thought that might be a little harsh, so decided maybe to not do that outside of just verbally saying it. But anyway, like Colleen said, welcome everybody for being here, and I'm sure we'll have some other folks join us too. But hi, I'm Christy Hamilton, and I am partner and COO here at Carey & Co., a nonprofit consulting firm specializing in back office services. We only work with nonprofits all of the time, and that is kind of our area of specialty and passion. But today we're here to talk about what walking burnout means, and there's never not a time to talk about improving our mental health. The topic's always relative, it's always timely. And our panel today is a representation of how to deal with this world, because I think that's what life is, trying to deal with being human, which is a very small thing. So before I introduce you to our panelists, I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we came here today. Last year, I came to the hard conclusion that I was experiencing burnout. Work was tough and it was changing often. As a person, I am happiest with change, like I'm the most comfortable there, but this was like even more than I had dealt with before. And I kept being asked this question, like, why is it bothering you so much? Why is work bothering you? And I thought, well, I want to be good at my job, so why wouldn't it? But the question kept coming, and perspective and objectivity have a way of doing that. And it wasn't until I saw an article in the Harvard Business Review that finally the truth I had been avoiding hit me in the face. Successful people can experience enmeshment at work, and that leads to burnout. So I was like, great, I'm enmeshed. What a humbling representation of where I was. And that kicked off a couple things, but it kicked off getting a chance to meet with Colleen, a psychologist who is helping nonprofits deal with burnouts. As I'm sure you've heard, but you will also see she's British, which has the unique vantage point of not being American. And when we were talking, she said to me, you guys are walking around burned out. You're the burnout people. Which made me laugh because it's true. And then she said to me, there are ways to cure that. So then I was introduced to Grace and how her work at a youth sports nonprofit in Chicago is in the trenches every day in de-escalation management and leadership and, how to effectively be a human at work. Her work told me about a story in Ireland where people were waiting to work at this nonprofit because it had a reputation for taking care of its people. And you could be yourself when you walked in, and not in a like bring your whole self to work kind of way, in a you're human. And if today you're not at your best, I can acknowledge that and help ease the workload. And with that story, I walked away with the idea of like healthy centers of gravity. If you're working with people that are spinning like right side on their axis, it's easier to keep everyone from tipping. But likewise, if everyone is lopsided, how can you expect to be upright and healthy? So your environment makes a difference, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody here, because we've all, I'm sure, had more than one job. So finally, I was talking to Travis, the founder and CEO of Carey & Co., and he made the joke that it was great his COO was out there talking about being burned out at work. And we both laughed because honestly, that's the point of us here: transparency, humanity. And I love talking about this now because it helps me, and I think it helps others, but also it's just reality, and pretending it isn't, it doesn't help anyone. So my takeaway was, and where we started our discussion, was your objectivity, your representation, and your environment were three things that I could use as like North Stars, guiding parameters. And with that, I want to turn it over to our good doctor here and let her walk us through how to spot walking burnout. Then we'll hear from Grace about how to put all of that into action. But they're super smart, and we have such a nice, small, intimate group. So I'm hoping that you'll ask questions and share thoughts, because that's what the panel is really here to do, is kind of talk us all through what walking burnout is. So Colleen, you're up.
Awesome. Well, before we begin, it would be so great to hear from you all in the chat. Where are you at? So which puppy represents you. As you can see, we're all dog people here and we love our puppies. So, how are you feeling? Luckily for you all, I'm not number two today. I am ready to go and alert. So, please do share with us how you're feeling. So, as we crack on, what is burnout? Let's talk a little bit about defining it, just so that we really understand what we're talking about and ensuring that we're all on the same page here. So burnout, particularly, within the nonprofit sector, but burnout in general, is really a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion. So this is when a person is feeling stressed over a long period of time. This is a prolonged state of stress, typically from overwork, deep emotional investment, which then often worsens due to limited resources and high mission demands, lots of demands on you, lots of things where you need to get done, and perhaps you're feeling very unsupported. And this can very much lead to emotional exhaustion, feeling very drained, very overwhelmed. And a lot of people may also experience cynicism, and that's just really disconnecting from people or from the work entirely and feeling very ineffective or unrecognized in the work that they're doing. But it's really important that we know the difference between burnout and stress. Stress is usually a short-term pressure, while burnout is a result of this long-term, long ongoing stress that then leads to an emotional exhaustion, which leads to that disengagement and that sense of hopelessness. So really important that we know the difference between the two so that we know how to treat these two very prominent issues that's plaguing the workforce today.
Because I guess what you're saying is like stress can be short term in some ways, right? But burnout is long term. And I think it's like if you're experiencing stress for months, it's probably not stress anymore. Is that a fair?
Absolutely. And just to share some statistics with you all, in the nonprofit realm, we know that 95% of US nonprofit leaders are concerned about staff burnout. This is a real worry. We know that 34% report a major concern, particularly over the past year. We also know that 76% of US nonprofit leaders say burnout is hurting their mission. And this is therefore impacting their performance, impacting the team morale and the service delivery as well. And we know that approximately 50+% of nonprofit employees cite stress and burnout as a reason for leaving. So emotional exhaustion, a lack of support. And this is really plaguing the industry. So important that we address this and we explore ways to mitigate this as well. Now I'm going to hand over to Grace, who's going to share a little bit about organization and resilience to burnout.
Good afternoon, everybody. So my question that feels like an impossible question is, can an organization be resilient to burnout? Um, I was able to do a research project about 10 years ago at a children's home in Dublin, Ireland. The social workers that were working at this home were in a career that averaged a 2-year turnover, but most folks within the organization had been there for 15 years happily. Um, Being a social worker within a residential care home is a difficult job. It's thankless. It's extremely vulnerable to secondary traumatic stress. And you had all of these folks lining up. They had an 100-person waiting list so that folks could work at this children's home. And so what I was able to do is I was able to talk to both the direct service folks in addition to supervisors, the founders, the people at the top of the top, and the folks doing the work, trying to get to the bottom of how do you do this? You're not changing the level of stress. You're not changing the nature of the job. You're not changing the task at hand. But somehow the individuals within this organization were able to be extremely resilient to burning out when they, by all understandings, shouldn't have been. A couple of the key takeaways that I understood when talking to folks within the organization is um, people really cared about the people doing work. I was able to interview a couple of folks, and one story that sticks out to me is there was a social worker named Kristen, who had experienced a really traumatic loss. She went into her job being like, all right, cool, like I need to do my job. I need to be present for all these young people who are experiencing traumatic change, and they're asking a lot from me. And within a month, this person had their supervisor come and say like, hey, something's a little off. What's going on? You're not working the way that you usually work. And within this like human-centered question, which is like, how are you doing? Not how, like, why are you doing poorly as an employee, but how are you doing and how is that impacting your work? They're able to negotiate a pretty awesome agreement, which was that this person was able to kind of take a couple months off of work, do the things that she needed to do to take care of herself, go to therapy, you know, process pretty difficult traumatic events, and then come back to work. Um,
I love that story.
when we're thinking about what it means to be resilient to burnout, um, we want to think about what individuals need to be able to not center work as the only thing that they're doing. With Christy's story of being enmeshed and being really preoccupied with doing work well and trying to figure out like what to do and how to do it well. One of the things that we do within Chicago is I run a coalition that's 130 organizations in an extremely underfunded and competitive sector. Um, and what we do is we think about different ways that we can support the whole pie instead of thinking about one individual within one organization. And instead, we think about what can we do for the sector of people who are thinking about, within this example, it's youth sports in Chicago, to make sure that they are becoming a sector that is more resilient to burning out, because we know that that provides better care for young people, that it allows for better run organizations, it creates more competitive grant applications, and it further confirms everything that we think to be true around how young people can be engaged through sport. The way that we do this is three ways. Um, we believe that more connected leaders are more resilient to burnout. The way that we do this is we host happy hours, we do trainings, we create roundtable discussions. An important thing here is that we not only do this for organizational leaders, but we also do it for folks throughout the organization. We found that especially operations folks are extremely lonely in their role. Depending on how big the organization is. Usually they're a team of one or two, and they're doing a lot of work without so much support throughout the organization. Um, Executive directors, too, they're at the tippy top. They're squeezed between the board and they're squeezed between their organization, especially at a time like now where funding is really, really quite short. Um, we try to cross all of the competitive boundaries out, and we say, hey, let's work together. Let's think about how we can support one another. Just because you're leading organizations that are competing for funding doesn't mean that you two as leaders are competing against each other. Another thing that we do is we improve access to resources and research. We actively run advocacy campaigns to increase public funding for the organization. So we are decreasing the experience of being underfunded, and we are limiting the amount of competition between nonprofits, in addition to creating sector-wide research opportunities so that folks are able to take it to different foundations and to funders and to different folks to say like, hey, this is my work. I'm doing it alongside 130 organizations, which kind of again confirms this idea that like it's not one person at one organization that's responsible for changing the city of Chicago, but rather you're in this team of thousands of people in a city who are working together to try to do something different. This leads to the third activity that we really drive within Chicago, which is it's a systems change perspective. One person can't boil the ocean, but if you have a bunch of people working on the same project, the same problem, it feels a lot easier and it feels a lot less hopeless. And so we create opportunities for folks throughout an organization to work on systems change work. And this can also kind of address some of the like limitations, boundaries, and the things that inform burnout, because you can't feel so hopeless if you're seeing systems change work outside of your organization where you're um, putting in a bunch of time, energy, and effort, and you're still being impacted by systems that are making your job extremely difficult, whether you're at the top or doing direct service.
And I wanted to share with you all some psychological theory behind burnout. So, what leaders should be striving to do is they should be designing systems that restore employees' energy via rest, recognition, and empowerment. And all three of those areas can really help to drive a culture that helps to eliminate burnout from occurring. And the work that I do in my business at Psychologists at Work, we strive to provide a strategy to help prevent burnout. We believe in a preventative style of wellness, not just, getting to that point where you are at the burnout. That's also valuable, and the care that we offer is available there too. But we really want to prevent people from getting there in the first place. So we view burnout not as a personal weakness, but as a systemic issue that's rooted in how work is structured and experienced. And some preventative methods there is really having a healthy, clear job design. When people understand their roles really well, this again helps to mitigate people falling into that state of burnout. Sometimes we find that people have a job role that is actually three jobs in one. And then we're wondering, oh, well, why is this person exhausted? Well, because they need two other people to be doing their job. We need strong leadership, and that type of leadership needs to encompass individuals who recognize wellness as a priority. We need environments that strive for individuals to feel psychologically safe. And when we talk about psychological safety, that's ensuring that people can feel themselves and be themselves within the workplace without any repercussion. Now, that doesn't mean that people just show up however they want to, but they're able to feel safe if they were to perhaps get things wrong or make a mistake, that the repercussion wouldn't result in such high levels of stress or worry or fear, for example. And then we want a culture that values boundaries and wellness overall. So are we having, emailing people or messaging them on their private phones past work hours about work activities? Or have we got boundaries in place where perhaps people have a work cell phone and that goes off at 5 p.m. and they can look at those messages the next day and that still be okay? And a couple of frequently asked questions in relation to burnout. And Christy mentioned this at the start around, can it be reversed? Can burnout be treated? Absolutely. With the right rest, support, role adjustments, and professional help, burnout can very much be reversed. There are long-term changes that will need to happen, but it is possible. And another question that we've been asked is burnout classed as a mental health disorder? It isn't. So burnout is not a mental health disorder, according to the DSM-5. However, they recognize that this is a crisis within the work space, and therefore there is a lot of work to do to ensure that employees aren't getting to that stage. So the roles that I play is really helping to assess burnout risks, design interventions, build healthy cultures, train leaders, and improve overall well-being. And ultimately, how can managers help staff avoid this? Well, we need to recognize the early warning signs. We need to be listening and responding to employee concerns. How many of you have regular, perhaps surveys that you can complete anonymously that actually get reviewed and what you share gets implemented? That's a huge way to build trust and start to administer change. And then when we look at who's most at risk, typically frontline staff, so perhaps caseworkers, healthcare providers, and people who are really on the front line, leaders with heavy responsibilities, with limited resources, or employees without any autonomy, recognition, and workers in emotionally demanding roles are typically those who are at high risk of burnout.
You had talked about this a while ago, and I wonder, I don't know how the story goes, but you had talked about how like the leaders are sometimes your focus where you are, right? And it's about like providing some kind of support system outside of it. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we run this coalition in Chicago called Sport for Good Chicago. It's 130 organizations, but every 2 weeks we run an executive director roundtable. We started doing this in COVID because it was as leaders were having to navigate all of the COVID protocol, but also like laying people off and thinking about furloughing. And there's so many things that we realize executive directors and CEOs and presidents of nonprofits like have to be thinking about. And there's actually no unbiased ear that you can be talking to because you're either you're working with your board or you're managing everyone below you. And I think that executive directors oftentimes, like as we think about like clear roles are part of preventing burnout, leaders don't necessarily have that because they're just filling in the blanks wherever they can because they understand how things work.
I love that. I know we try and do that. And I was just saying this at the top of the webinar. It's we do peer groups here at Carrie & Co, both internal and external. And we do have a CEO peer group that is external. Because what we have found is that like it is difficult to find that unbiased ear. It is difficult to come up with like all of the tactics and techniques that you need. And I know this one sticks out to me, Grace, because there was also one that it was like how to teach people to de-escalate, how to teach people like in that situation where all of the tempers are high, how do you show up and be that person that doesn't have to like amp everything up above like the red line that people are experiencing?
Thank you. Thank you for those insights. So some questions for you all to consider. And these questions are not diagnostic, but can just help prompt a little bit of reflection within yourselves. So if you do answer yes to several, it might be helpful to explore some support options or some personal, organizational, or clinical. But as I say, and to reiterate, they are not diagnostic. So don't panic if you do answer yes to these questions. It's just a good way to open up some dialogue and explore where you are all at. So have a look at the screen and I will be going through each one. So emotional exhaustion. Do you often feel drained, emotionally numb, or too tired to engage meaningfully with work or people outside of work, even after resting? So simply yes or no. Reduced performance. Have you noticed a decline in your motivation, focus, or sense of accomplishment at work, even for tasks you used to enjoy or complete easily? Cynicism or detachment. Do you feel increasingly cynical, disconnected, or indifferent toward your job, colleagues, or the organization as a whole? And your physical and psychological strain, are you experiencing frequent headaches, sleep disturbances, or anxiety that you believe is linked to your work environment?
Oh, what a good way to end that sentence right there. Because I think all of those other things can be attached to like the state of the world, especially. But I think it's important in these non-diagnostic questions, as good doctor has said, to look and see if you can't trace it back, right? And I think that's representation, right? Is it really the world? Is it whatever those things are? Is it the volatile funding? But is it also at work? Like, are you having issues with colleagues? Are you not clear on your job? I was just talking to my internal team yesterday being like, do you have clarity on your job? Because it's a good time to tell me if you don't or if you do. And obviously you can think about it. But this is like a good way to like say, hey, this is either working or it isn't. And I think also asking that information back, I think is really helpful. And then I think the cynicism and detachment, I know I feel that a lot because I think, and I'm not even a frontline worker, right? But like at the end of the day, most of our nonprofits here are really in the trenches, right? And I think if I hear one story, I've heard it 100 times about, I don't know where my funding's coming. I can't recruit people. I can't retain people. What is everybody else doing is like the question we get the most is like, what are our other organizations doing to survive this? Go back up to the puppy slide because we've had a lot of folks join us. So we did kick off this webinar of like saying like from our puppies here, like, how are you feeling? Right. And I think we did have a couple, like some good answers of, 4 is great. But I think a lot of these things I think is where we'd like to kick it off. So like from what did any folks hear? What did you hear? What are your thoughts? What are your takeaways?
The only thing I can add is I think it's a good conversation that it's basically saying that we should at least think about this and that maybe a lot of people aren't considering the issue of burnout and how to address it.
That is a good thought. I guess here's another question that I had. And Grace, you had just said this, and I'm not sure how many of us think about it, but you said something about competitions between nonprofits, right? And I think there's always competition at the funding level. We all understand that. But what does that work look like day to day? So talk to us a little bit about that.
So I think that one of the things that we've really done in Chicago, we work specifically with organizations that use youth sport programming as a way to engage with young people. Um, and we have to do a lot of convincing to folks that we're not competing against each other, but we are on the same team. I honestly think that part of it is like being able to have the healthy analogy that's like really readily available of sports because they're all sports people. And so we're like, we're not playing an individual sport here. We're changing this into a team sport. And I think that a lot of that comes from our ability to gather everyone together, but also to act as a funder. Um, as an example, within Chicago, we increased the funding landscape for this specific type of programming from around like $150,000 for the sector to over 7 million. And so we do this through collective action work. And so we're kind of proving to people like, hey, like the result shows like if we're working together, if we're identifying systems problems and not just the specific problem of having a foundation have 10 grants and you're not one of those 10 grants, like that's not the problem that we're really trying to change here. The problem that we're trying to change is young people having supportive systems to be who they are. And so I think that a lot of what we do is trying to reframe the problem and then offer pathways to a solution that's like really allowing an escape route out of the mentality that a lot of nonprofits can get into, which is my one individual staff person at this one organization is meant to change the world, which we've seen that kind of pressure like really impacts people's ability to kind of keep perspective on what they're supposed to be doing and how they think about it. So it's both like changing the reality by doing all this work within the funding landscape, but then also like creating all these environments where we're like, yeah, you think that's your enemy because you're competing for funding. Yeah, you are competing for funding. And that's not what we're doing here. What we're trying to do is to change the system as a whole, and we need to all work together to do that. It
I
took
love
a really long time to do
that.
that. Not actually so long. We started doing this in 2018, and by 2022, we had, I think, like times 20 the funding landscape. But it is important to be thinking about the framework that individual organizations have and kind of how people can step out of that framework and think a little bit more broadly, which allows the competition narrative to kind of step by the wayside and think about how people can collaborate.
So we have a question here in the Q&A box. So if you do have a question and you're not wanting to speak, but you can type, please do. This question is from Maria, and she says, how do you deal with people who do not want to be open to different ways of managing? Like people who think that the fact that you work in a non-profit means having to struggle.
Oh, that is the question, right? Isn't that the elephant in the room? Like this is the culture. We are the burnout people, guys. So I guess we have that. But Colleen, what do you think?
Well, I think it's about a mindset shift. I think people need to start to think about their own mindset and mentality and decide if that is in alignment with the mission that the nonprofit has. And sometimes it might not be. So we have to decide which mindset are we going to go with? Are we going to go with one that is abundant, a go-getter mindset? One that believes that we can achieve, that we can rise above challenges, or are we going to have a struggle love type mindset when it comes to nonprofit? And I think mindset is really what speaks to our everyday life. if we have a goal in mind, we have to start doing things to get to that goal. But if your mindset is, I'm never going to achieve that, I'm never going to be able to do this, then you're probably not going to get to that goal. So for me, I think to answer that question, it's really analyzing your mentality and the mindset and knowing kind of where your passion is and deciding if that's going to be your motivator. How are you motivated, internally or externally? Understanding intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation plays a huge role, I believe.
I think it's a great point, but I also want to say, like, we all know somebody like that in every one of our organizations. We have someone who is like, forget it, me or hell or high water. I am not changing my mind and I am not wrong. Right. And I think that's one of the pieces that I hear a lot when we get to meet all of you of like, this person won't, I don't know who else is in this room, but at one point I had talked to an organization and the person that was doing their AP was 88 years old. And this 88-year-old person did not want to automate. He wanted to continue to do all of the bill paid by paper. And what's difficult about that, right, is that it bottlenecks. And that's kind of like then becomes the pain point, the focus point. But what I do love about it is that, and I won't say how all of that came to be, but what we did here at Carey was that there's a motivation that is different for everybody. And you as a leader do need to understand some categories of where your employees fall in. I think for us, we have different work-life balance. We have a lot of people that do, I have one person who also is a personal trainer. So what they work a 4-day work week with us. And then that one day they go out and they do their personal training and those other pieces, because that's how you keep alignment with your people. Now, I'm not saying that is something that everybody can do, because that's also a can of worms. But I think understanding that motivation, that obviously it's money. Everybody wants to talk about their comp, but there is other ways. And I think the hybrid, remote and on-site stuff is usually another conversation point that we see here. I also think having other people be around that room and acknowledging that person being a pain point, and not in a, there's always the griping way, don't get me wrong, but there is also a way of saying, if there is a team of 10 and we have one person that we know we have to work around, it is good to say to the other 9 people, okay, we know what the pain point is, so we have to figure out how to work around it. I'm not saying it's efficient, but sometimes those are like where your hands are tied. But Grace, you want to talk about it?
I think that this is kind of a structural thing, but sometimes the people who like think you need to struggle in a nonprofit, it's like coming from a budget standpoint, which is how much of your budget is going to direct service, how much of your budget is going to overhead. And I think that it could also be a systems question, which is like, what's informing your culture around wanting people to struggle? Is it that you want to cut overhead costs so that you can redirect it to direct service? Is there grants that are informing that, where they're, public grants can limit the amount of de minimis? And is that like is it that the type of money that your organization is running on, is it informing a culture where leaders of the organization have been rewarded for creating a bare bones
Yeah.
culture? Because it could just be like looking at how much money you can actually spend on your personnel versus what you're spending, and kind of understanding if there's actually like a discrepancy in understanding of what you can do and what you have historically done, or what leaders or your board have encouraged, because that's what they think good nonprofit management is. Nonprofits 20 years ago had a very different mentality around what it meant to run a well-run, well-budgeted organization. And I think that it depends on what kind of struggle you're talking about, but I think sometimes it's like the mentality that nonprofit folks aren't supposed to have resources because you shouldn't spend money on personnel, you should spend money on the
Right. Oh,
whatever
overhead.
whatever nonprofit thing you're doing. But if you are in a position to understand what's driving that person and thinking about why struggling is necessary, there's some ways to move around that too.
At that point.
Thank you, Grace. And another question for you. Grace, when you were able to provide the funding game, you were able to prove that there is a surplus. So the competition factor wasn't as prevalent. What would you do to help reduce competition without the element of surplus?
So I would say that there wasn't surplus with that funding gain. We were able to fund 51 organizations, but that's within a coalition of 130. Um, and we have since then proven to the Illinois state government that that funding's so necessary that they should put it into annual budgets, and we'll know if that's happening by the end of the week. But I think that some of the things that we do as a funder to kind of understand the environment of competition is when we do grant protocols like this, we'll see, how many people applied, how many people actually run good enough programming to receive the kinds of grants that we were rewarding. Within this grant protocol, it was between 50,000 and 200,000. But I think that there's a thing that happens when people feel like there's enough for everybody, and at the same time we see our job as continuously bringing people to the table so that we're not kind of reaching a manufactured ceiling, because there's a lot of organizations that are doing really great work that are smaller, that are like that we don't know yet. And so we are actively trying to understand the sector in a way that is kind of redefining what surplus looks like, because we're not there yet. And that's mostly through all of these community building activities that we're doing. So we're finding new organizations, understanding how they need support, and then doing what we can within the funding landscape.
Thank you. That's all the questions. If you do have any more, please do, or feel free to contribute.
I have a question about sort of generational differences in how we think about burnout and how working styles seem to be different generation to generation. And I'm going to add like another layer here of I think there's just been a lot of change in the way that people understand burnout in the recent past, like post-COVID or maybe even pre-COVID. And I guess my question here is sort of what's your advice around all of those moving pieces?
Thank you so much for that question. Well, you're absolutely right. There is a major shift or difference, if you will, between generations from boomers right down to Gen Z when it comes to the concept of wellness and well-being. From a sort of boomer generation, this idea of just be resilient and keep going and keep working until the wheels fall off seems to be a very common way of viewing burnout, in comparison to perhaps Gen Z, who is all about self-care and, balancing themselves. So we really have to kind of draw a middle ground, because it can be too much to the point where it can become a bit of a fashion trend and nothing's actually happening. And then if we go to the other side, we're not doing enough. So we really have to find that happy middle. So I would say that we need to get to a middle ground when it comes to well-being. I think we don't want to be too far to the point where we don't want to work at all, right? Which low-key sounds nice. But we do have to work, but we also don't want to be, on the extreme end of things where we're working ourselves to early graves. So really finding that middle ground, I would say, is crucial as we are working intergenerationally in the workplace.
The generational piece and then the kind of evolution of our understanding of burnout, like I guess I would say like as a society.
Well, I think, AI is now involving itself in the mental health and wellness conversation. We're finding that people now are reaching out a lot to ChatGPT. I mean, the relationships that people are developing with AI is beyond my comprehension at this point, but it's evolving in that way. I think people are sort of reaching out more to technology when it comes to their well-being, and there's room for that, but I believe that it should never replace human interactions or human professional interventions when it comes to this area, because we don't want it to evolve past humans. I mean, maybe I'm just saying that to save myself. I don't know. But I can see that the data shows that the Gen Zs are reaching out more to AI and ChatGPT when they are feeling anxious or burnt out, in comparison to other generations who are still very much relying on human intervention. So there is an evolution in that space.
One thing that I think we understood in the post-COVID world is people are just extremely lonely. The idea of a workplace culture, the idea of like being able to like take natural breaks during the workday or getting lunch with coworkers, like the amount of people who have scheduled themselves out of a lunch break, out of a commute, out of leaving their home, out of making sure that they are working alongside people. And I also think that the way that we've like redefined productivity to be, you open your computer at 8 a.m., you work throughout the day, you're scheduling meetings where there's no space to travel to them, where there's no space to kind of talk to people outside of it. We've just found that people are really, really lonely across the whole sector.
I to that point, because I think the hybrid remote thing that you're talking about is so tricky, right? And it's like, I need community, but I also want to live my life the way that I want it. And I want to have lunch at home. And I remember there was an article, I think, I don't know, halfway through the pandemic that was talking about like the struggles that chief people officers were also experiencing, because how do you encourage your HR department to be like, okay, bring the community together, bring folks that work here, like make sure that they're getting the social interactions that drive them to go to work, and how difficult it was, because then work for the first time in a while does seem to be like an abstract community center for people, when in reality, like up until a couple years ago, we were all commuting a really long time and you saw your coworkers more than you did your family. And so then that adjustment back, just like anything I think that we do, it's like all the way here and then all the way here, is like trying to figure out or tighten that arc so you get a little closer to like what we would call balance in this new world. But I think it's difficult, because I think there is in nonprofits, it can be hard to recruit, but it cannot be hard to compete to recruit. And some of these ways, like if you don't have the comp, well, it's like, well, I can offer you remote or on-site or flexible work hours. But then what does that mean community wise? I have an employee out in California that was just talking to me about this now. And in general, he is a person that would prefer numbers and not words. And I will say that, and he knows that about himself. But it can be even more challenging with people that are introverted, that used to just have the draft, whatever you call that thing in racing, that from people being together, that they also got that sense of community or social interaction. I don't know. I think everybody's struggling to figure that out, but I think it'll be a couple more years before we actually do understand like what our new social community centers will be like and what the role of work has to do in that.
Great, thank you. Any more questions, comments, or thoughts before we close?
So glad that we gave Colleen that, because now it's just this nice accent that says all of these wonderful things. Hi, these are our closing remarks. Well, thanks, Jenny. Thanks everyone for coming to attend. This was our first kind of Carrie and Co panelist webinar things. We're going to try and start doing some more of them, but thank you all for joining us. It was a lot of fun. And if you need anything, Colleen's got to cut this up and make them clips. And we're going to send out the PowerPoint that we did just for the statistics and everything else. But thank you all for coming, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.